Details of the campaign can be found on the ACM site www.norepublic.com.au. Just click on the icon Return the Governor. Our sixth point was that the governor must live in inner Sydney. This means that nobody who has not got a house in Sydney can be appointed as governor. Well, who couldn't be appointed? Corporal Donaldson, Victoria Cross, doesn't live in Sydney. He couldn't be appointed. General Jeffrey, the former Governor-General, couldn't be appointed. In fact, none of the living Victoria Cross winners in Australia could be appointed. None of them lives in Sydney. Nor could anybody from country New South Wales. You have to be living in Sydney. So he could be appointed. Mr. Bob Carr lives in Sydney. He could be appointed as governor. The seventh point was there was no consultation about this. There was no consultation with the people of New South Wales. There was no consultation with the Parliament of New South Wales. There was no consultation with the caucus, nor even the cabinet. It was a decision taken by the Premier alone. And almost everyone opposed it, including Republicans. The late distinguished journalist Paddy McGuinness warned that the eviction would damage the Keating government. In fact, later on, Mr. Keating told the ABC that Bob Carr was to blame for his loss in losing the '96 election, principally because he had kicked the governor out of Government House. He'd kicked the governor out of Government House, and this caused Mr. Keating's loss of the 1996 election. And we're the only state that does this. Even in Hobart, Richard Butler remained at Government House. When there were proposals in Queensland to follow the New South Wales example, the Executive Director of ACM, Kerry Jones, wrote to the Queensland Premier, Peter Beattie, pointing out that if this were to happen, a similar demonstration would be held in Brisbane, and it would attract many people. And it was just before the state election. Mr. Beattie replied to Kerry, "Dear Kerry, have no fear. This will not happen." Mr. Beattie went on to win the Queensland election. There was a scene at the time of the eviction which showed, and there's a photo in the newspapers, it was a photo of Mr. Carr standing behind a seated new governor, Gordon Samuels, and looking rather Svengali-like. And during the course of the photograph being taken, Mr. Carr quipped, "That one's for Jack Lang." Jack Lang was dismissed after many warnings by the Governor of New South Wales, Sir Philip Game, who was horrified by the fact that Jack Lang was disobeying Commonwealth legislation which required that interest be paid on the debts of New South Wales first. In fact, Mr. Lang went so far as to direct that the money in state bank accounts be taken out. The money was in fact taken out and was moved to the Trades Hall. The Governor warned him. When Mr. Lang persisted, the Governor removed his commission, appointed the Leader of the Opposition on condition that an election was advised and an election was held in New South Wales. Then in 2005, after he had retired, when he was speaking at the relaunch of Mr. Gough Whitlam's book on his dismissal in 1975, Mr. Carr made a remarkable statement. He said to Gough Whitlam, your victory over Sir John Kerr is complete. The battlefield has been abandoned. The reserve powers no longer exist. Now, the reserve powers, as most people know, are those powers of the governor or the governor-general to act without the advice of the Prime Minister or Premier, even contrary to that advice, on matters of constitutional consequence, where the governor or the governor-general acts as an important check and balance, where, for example, the Prime Minister or the Premier is behaving illegally or unconstitutionally. Here's Mr. Carr in 2005 saying the reserve powers no longer exist. And of course the implication is, I got rid of them. Well, he didn't. But he went on to say this: living in the gilded cage of Admiralty House and Yarralumla, being attended on by security chiefs, ambassadors and visiting heads of state, created the illusion in this man, that is, Sir John Kerr, that the paper role of Governor-General had a reality. What Bob Carr is saying there is that the Governor-General is just a rubber stamp, that the governor is just a rubber stamp. Their important role as a check and balance on the politicians no longer exists. It was Winston Churchill who made this point very clear. The power of the Crown is important not so much for the power it wields, but the power it denies others. The Crown is an important check and balance on the politicians, and it should not be surrendered, nor should it be neutralized. But clearly, in 2005, Mr. Carr believes that his action in evicting the governor had the effect of neutralizing the reserve powers. An extraordinary statement, and of course untrue. And what Mr. Carr's mind was particularly concentrated on, in his reference to the potentially corrupting role of the viceregal office, was the dismissal of Gough Whitlam by Sir John Kerr. Here we see Sir David Smith reading the dissolution of the Parliament, and there on the right you see the new government appointed after Mr. Whitlam was dismissed, with Sir John Kerr, Malcolm Fraser on the left, Doug Anthony on the right, and Sir Philip Lynch following behind. Battlefield has been abandoned. 2000, the reserve powers no longer exist. Your victory implicates the bombshell to reserve powers no longer exist because I have evicted the Governor of New South Wales. There was one good side of this whole process. It gave us evidence about the level of interest in a republic. ACM's 1996 demonstration brought out over 20,000 people into the streets of Sydney, and a petition signed by 60,000 people. Now, during the referendum, just before the vote, I think it was the Friday or so before the vote, a Republican celebrity rally was held at Parramatta Park. It was promoted heavily every day in the Daily Telegraph, the biggest circulating newspaper in Sydney. It was promoted in a column called Crown Against Country. Crown Against Country, so you could see where the newspaper was heading. And it was to be at lunchtime in the geographical heart of Sydney, when schools and offices would be emptying out for the lunch hour. So they held this rally, and they expected an exciting crowd, and there were journalists there and television reporters there. They got about 70 people, including the journalists and the Republican celebrity speakers. You won't be surprised to know that very little of this was reported. I don't think it was reported at all in the evening television news. Then a few years ago, in the Mate for a Head of State campaign, to culminate the campaign, there was a sausage sizzle at Bondi Beach. It was again promoted heavily in the media. It's interesting to know how many people turned up for this sausage sizzle in this great campaign, Mate for a Head of State. About 50 people turned up, with queues of people lining up to buy sausages, not free Republican sausages, but to buy sausages at the North Bondi Surf Club. You can see the level of interest in the general public about Australia becoming a politician's republic. Over 20,000 for the monarchist demonstration, 70 and 50 for the two Republican demonstrations. A good side to this sorry debacle. Remember particularly what Rodney Cavalier said. And remember that Mr. Cavalier was a Labour minister. He said this: the spread of opposition to the eviction surprised Premier Carr, and it brought home to him, Premier Carr, a lifelong Republican, the weakness of the Republican cause in Australia. The weakness of the Republican cause in Australia. That's the ACM campaign. It's to reverse the state government's power grab. It's to stop their waste. And it's to reverse their insult to the people of country New South Wales, none of whom can be appointed as governor. Return the governor to Government House.